Hello everyone, my name is Brennan Marr, and that noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Today we're going to talk about video games. The first half of the show, we will discuss the classic Star Wars video games. And in the second half of the show, we will discuss the current state of Star Wars gaming. Let us begin. In the 1990s, there were Star Wars games everywhere. This lasted well into the mid-2000s. There are probably somewhere in the woods of around 100 Star Wars video games. The first Star Wars video game was released in 1982. And it was The Empire Strikes Back for the Atari 2600. This was a very simple game. You were playing as a snowspeeder taking down a line of AT-ATs during the Battle of Hoth, as seen in the beginning of The Empire Strikes Back. That was the first Star Wars video game. Now, the 80s had some, I think, 2 or 3 Atari titles and several arcade games. But things didn't really take off until 1993. If I'm not mistaken, around 1991, Lucasfilm Games became LucasArts. Of course, we could also talk about the long line of Lucasfilm games, such as Monkey Island, The Day of the Tentacle, Loom, and other games like that. But when it comes just to Star Wars games, LucasArts, the newly formed LucasArts, released X-Wing for the PC in 1993. Star Wars X-Wing I played a lot as a kid, and I loved it very much. But then the sequel came, Star Wars TIE Fighter, which to me is still one of the greatest Star Wars games ever, if not the best, and you played as an Imperial pilot. The first time you got to play as one of the bad guys. Of course, there were games like Dark Forces, Shadows of the Empire, and many, many, many more. Now, there's a lot we could talk about, but this was a golden age of Star Wars games. A time that I miss very much and look back very fondly on. Now, that era kind of came to a close. The mid-2000s was kind of the end of Star Wars games. Now, of course, Star Wars Battlefront and Battlefront 2 became, at least at that time, some of the best-selling Star Wars games ever. One could argue that the final Star Wars game that really was the end of an era was Star Wars The Force Unleashed. Unfortunately, Star Wars The Old Republic came out during a time when Star Wars games began to wane. I wonder if they knew that the purchase of Lucasfilm by Disney would be coming. Now, some of the best games, of course, of this golden era were the ones that I mentioned, and also Knights of the Old Republic. First released on the Xbox in 2002. Hot take, I prefer the sequel, Knights of the Old Republic to the Sith Lords, which to me is kind of the Empire Strikes Back of that series. Now, unfortunately, that game was rushed and so it wasn't as polished. But that being said, with the restored content mod, to me, it's one of the finest role-playing games, which deconstructs Star Wars in such a brilliant way. Now, Knights of the Old Republic is a favorite among the fans. And I enjoyed the first game, but I don't love it quite to that degree. But what I can say is that the gameplay is almost unparalleled. And the brilliant idea of taking the Star Wars pen and paper role-playing game and turning it into a narrative game, which basically is Star Wars D&D, combined with the rich texture of the Old Republic era as contained in the Tales of the Jedi comics. Truly an extraordinary feat. What an age it was for Star Wars games. I remember endlessly anticipating Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast, reading the articles in PC Gamer about that game as it was coming out. I remember playing Shadows of the Empire on the N64. I remember playing Star Wars Episode 1 Pod Racer, also on the N64. That's a fun game. It truly was a golden age. Something I look back on very fondly. And I hope you do too. Okay, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will talk about the current state of Star Wars gaming. See you in a minute. Hello there, this is Brennan Marr, host of Page Turners They Were Not, a Star Wars podcast. And I'm here to tell you about Anchor. Anchor is the best way to make a podcast. Why is that? Well, first off, it's free. Yes, you heard me right. Anchor is free. Anchor has all the tools you need to make a podcast from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you on various platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can make money from your podcast. And get this, with no minimum listenership. That means you can make money even if no one listens to your podcast. That, of course, is not ideal, as Anchor will allow you to spread your podcast, bring in more viewers, and you can make more money because of it. Everything you need to make a podcast is in one place on Anchor. If you're interested, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you, and may the Force be with you. You've just listened to a word about our sponsor. Okay, we are back. Nowadays, there is a dearth of games. There are very few Star Wars games. Now, it's an interesting time we live in. When the Star Wars canon was redefined in 2014, they said that all books, comics, and games going forth, unless explicitly stated otherwise, were canon. That was kind of true in the old days, but back then was a much more complicated time as far as canon was concerned. Now, the problem with saying that games are canon is that if games are up to the players to make the decisions, what then is the canonical path that they should follow? Now, we know this in Jedi Fallen Order, that brand spanking new game, because it is a linear game, so it has a linear story. And even though you're the one playing it, you're not actually making decisions that guide the story. Unlike Knights of the Old Republic, where it was all about your choice to be good or evil that defined where the game went. Now, of course, those we know canonically, or at least in what they called canon back in the old days, that the light side was always the choice you should go with. And may I just say really quickly, my one big complaint about the original Knights of the Old Republic was that the choices seemed very ridiculous. In the sense that it was like, well, be light side, be nice, and follow the story. Or do something petty and mean, which did not feel like that's where the story wanted you to go. Whereas Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords, made your moral choices feel much more compelling. One other problem with the original game was that you would get a better reward, whether it be in experience points or force points, if you chose the light side. And in my mind, rewarding you more for choosing the light seems counterintuitive to what Star Wars has always been about. About that it's harder to make the right decision. That's the lesson of Star Wars. Whereas Knights of the Old Republic 2, sometimes the dark side choice could be more compelling and rewarding. So it was a much more morally complex game. Now, obviously, I would like to see a morally complex Star Wars game in the new canon. But we'll get to that in a minute. Now, there haven't been a lot of Star Wars games in the new era. In fact, the first games were mobile games, which I have not played. I know very little about, and obviously they didn't get talked about very much. There have been Star Wars Battlefront and Star Wars Battlefront 2, which I think is a little bit strange that they kept the exact same titles as games that came out 15 years ago. Now, Battlefront, the new one, had no story. It is you on the battlefield as a single soldier fighting in a big battle. And the second one, though, had a story mode, which I am not that familiar with the story contained in there, so I can't really comment on that. Other than I've heard some divided opinions on the story. Furthermore, the idea of these games being canon, as I said, if you on the battlefield are driving the story by your individual choices, what then is the canonical victory? And that's a debate almost for its own episode. But it was good to see that they had a narrative story in the second Battlefront. And now, of course, Jedi Fallen Order is a story-driven game, which I have watched the long plays of, and I was very impressed. I like the story, I like the characters. Now, in the story mode in Battlefront 2, and in Jedi Fallen Order, there was performance capture on the actors for their performances. Now, what very little I've seen of Battlefront 2's story mode, it seemed that the acting was kind of poor. Or at least very, very overdone. But then again, like I said, I've seen so very little of it, I can't really comment. But I will say that I was very convinced by the performances in Jedi Fallen Order. Both games, this is accomplished by performance capture, where actual actors come in and play the parts. In performance capture, so visually the characters look like them. Now, they started this back in the old days, in 2009, with The Force Unleashed. Yet again, I didn't really think that the acting was really there then. But this was back when performance capture was still in its infancy. Or at least infancy as games were concerned. So that being said, there's very few games in this modern era. I'm so glad of the reception that Fallen Order got. That it sold well, fans liked it, it was well received by the critics. So yeah, I'm just so glad to see that, and I really hope that this will open the floodgates for new Star Wars games. Because I feel that we need more. Now, I don't have any particular that I'd like to pitch other than I would very much like to see a real-time strategy game. That is one genre of game that we have not seen a lot of in Star Wars, other than Galactic Battlegrounds and Empire at War. But that I would like to see, with a bit of a StarCraft 2 flair, where not only is it a strategy game, but the story is very immersive, so you really get a sense of the universe. And if I'm pitching this, I want it to be set long before the movies. Somewhere that we know very little about. And I think it would be fun to see it in the ancient times of Star Wars. There are a few other games that I could suggest, but I think I'll leave it at that. Maybe a Star Wars fighting game in the vein of Mortal Kombat 11. They tried that once with the Masters of Terrascasi, but that game was not good. So those are a few thoughts. So those are my thoughts on the state of Star Wars gaming. Let me know what you think about the current state, and let me know what games you enjoyed from the Star Wars saga. My name is Brennan Murray, and that noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.